Um, Today I should present the findings from the research. What I would like, I'm not going to do this because you will be, particularly guests will be too bored with the local particularities in Slovenia. What I would like to do is to analyze the trends in order to see possible developments in the future and also think about our response. I would like only to give some observations. First observation is an enormous gap, at least in Slovenia, enormous gap between the labor law level and state control over implementation of labor law. Namely, labor level guarantees all workers' rights, including all types of precariat or all types of workers in atypical forms of employment. Meanwhile, the level beneath a law level, state control over implementation, completely collapsed, and workers are left on their own to fight for the rights. I can give a few examples which are the most illustrative. First are, for instance, illegal agencies. These are businesses whose core operation is recruiting workers in Slovenia and also in other areas, particularly in Balkan countries, and to rent them in Slovenia or other more distant European countries. Such businesses were noticed during the regular controls by inspectorate, but actually they have no means to close them down and to prevent actually human trafficking for labor exploitation. The second example is bogus self-employed. You know, this type of precariat work. Slovene labor law has all means to transform, or labor law says that such kinds of employment should be transformed into regular types of employment. But actually, workers can get this status, can achieve this transformation only through lawsuits which are too expensive or too long procedures for them. The third example is our social security and pension contributions. Goran here in front of me knows very well this situation. Many employers do not pay social security and pension contributions. State institutions like tax office or health security fund could easily prevent such actions, but do nothing about it. So employers now own a big quantity of money to health and pension fund. The next slide. The next slide will show we usually speak in Slovenia and other European countries about workers in atypical employments or about precariat, more or less as an exemption. Here is a graph with data provided by Statistical Office, which shows that atypical employments are not exceptional anymore, that they represent actually 40% of all working people, among them fixed-term employment, self-employed, farmers or non-farmers, part-time employment, and micro-entrepreneurs, companies with only one employed person. Included are not student work, which is very much spread practice among atypical workers. Next slide, please. What I was interested in are who are precarious workers in atypical forms of employment. As I said, legally and formally they are defined as exceptions from the general form of employment, that is open-ended employment contract with full social rights defined in labor law. But there is actually the proliferation of various types of precarious work, and also the line between the atypical forms and standard employment is fading out. And the second question I was interested in is the language of slavery, which is often used in the books about the precariat or atypical employments. So I I wanted to go behind this language of slavery and to see what are really modern forms of slavery. For this reason, I was interested in the act of the purchase of labor force. Then it's a moment when the buyer and the seller of the labor power set an agreement about the wage, about the working conditions, and so on, what actually ideologically appears as a labor market. A man whose work is very inspiring for all who studied labor relations, Karl Marx, Capital, said about labor market as it is Eden of the innate rights of men, but there alone rule freedom, equality, property, and bantam. Freedom, because they contract as free agents, restrained only by their own free will. Equality, because they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own. And bantam, because each looks only to himself. I would like to quote a passage from Karl Marx in which he describes this passage from the passage from the labor market, or this act of agreement, into production. I quote, "On leaving this sphere of simple circulation or of exchange of commodities, which furnishes the free trader vulgaris with his views and ideas, and with the standard by which he judges a society based on capital and wages, we think we can perceive a change in the physiognomy of our dramatis persona. He who before was the money owner now strides in front as capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his laborer. The one with an air of importance, smirking, intent on business, the other timid and holding back, like one who is bringing his own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a hiding." You see that Karl Marx is interested in a secret of profit making, and this, what he calls the purchase of labor power, a simple circulation, really doesn't interest him. But we need to stop these two dramatis personae, these two, a buyer and the seller of labor force, before they leave the scene, and introduce another, the third person, the third dramatis persona, the mediator. Usually, people whom the flexibilization topic rely on theotism as an example for the flexibilization and new modes of working relations. But actually, we had very similar working arrangements in the 19th century, and it is less now, it is inside contract system. It was used in American and European, at that time, high-tech companies, construction of sewing machine, locomotives, army industry, and so on. And actually, workers were working in one factory under the same roof, while and the working process was distributed among contractors, who set wages and hired workers by themselves. And then the state is also a kind of mediator. We know, I will give only one example. After the Black Plague, when there was a great demand for the laborers, and once in the history the laborers could profit from the demand and supply law, because there was great need for the laborers. The English king issued a law which limited the wages on the level before the Black Plague, and made several punishment on those who would not obey the law. And the rule of state was very similar since then. It fixed the highest wages and not the minimum wages, for instance, as today. Then we can get very sporadic notes about this rule of mediator. a gangmaster, for instance, people who hiring a bunch of groups and rent them to agricultural landlords, and they are much spread, for instance today, as in 19th century in England, in agriculture business, as well as other European countries. We can find also very strange systems, for instance, like slaves for hire or Pao Kung system in China, where the contractor get the children from the parents and rent them to the big foreign factories in China. Well, actually, what Marx is referring about the purchase of labor force, it is, next slide please, and it is face-to-face negotiation between the buyer and the seller of the labor force. And if we compare this with the Brodell's three phases of economic development, material life, economic life, and capitalism, what he thinks about the labor market is actually the pre-capitalist stage, when the buyer and the seller of the labor force directly exchange goods they possess, and when it is the stage when the competitive markets really existed. But actually, in the past, and it is more real for contemporary societies, the role of mediators is emerging, and actually it complies with the third Brodell's phases. It is capitalism, which, according to the Brodell, is the epoch of anti-markets, where the buyer and the seller exchange their commodities through mediators, that is merchants, and which is also the epoch of dissolution of market economy by monopoles. What conditions make possible to emerge what I call private labor markets are actually that labor market is not unique, but it consists from many different labor markets. For instance, migrant workers who have very limited access to labor market in guest countries. Then female workers are one of such groups. For instance, in European statistics, female workers receive lower wages than men, but they are less exposed to the poverty than men. So this is an interesting contradiction, which we can explain that the revenue from the female workers is important for the household, which combines the revenues from different sources. And this source is important, but can be below the minimum wage. So in this way, in the way how households try to survive, is a particular labor market created with female workers who can afford to work for below the minimum wage. And there are many such specific labor markets, like student work or first entrance to the labor market, and so on. From this we can see that actually we have dual labor exploitation. On the first level, workers are exploited in the production process. And on the second level, we have expropriation, the level when workers are exploited through mediators or other systems which were already described, credit systems, and the part of their wage is expropriated by mediators or banks, financial institutions, and so on. So, particularity of contemporary labor regime is this dual labor exploitation. Next slide, please. Who are the agents of private labor markets? Of course, first that come to our mind are private employment agencies. Then, as I mentioned already, there are agencies who are not registered, who are not legitimate, whose actions are not legitimate, but whose operations are very spread. And this afternoon, one of the workers will speak about the practices with such agencies. Then there are also outsourced companies. This could be regular operations, and these are businesses whose only core activities is to hire. They seem to provide some services to the partner, to business partner, but actually their core activities are hiring workers to another company. Then I would include also dependent companies. For instance, companies which are integrated into multinational structures. They do not necessarily be under the ownership of these companies, but because multinationals are the only purchaser of their products, they have workers employed in these companies, either regular or precarious, have to absorb the market risk. So we can see that also the permanent workers in standard employment can be very in precarious conditions, and research Stanojević, industrial sociologist, made the working conditions of these workers very much resembles to conditions of workers in unregistered agencies or some outsourced companies. Then are also self-employed workers. They are also the agents of private labor markets. Marx described these self-employed workers in very good manner. That these are capitalists who hire themselves as wage workers. So they can be also they are mediators to themselves. And all these workers who work in those companies, we can call second-hand workers. I will come to the conclusions. What are the prospects of these processes? If we put it in theoretical language, it is what is going on: separation of immediate consumption of labor force from the placement of workers. Labor force becomes a commodity that can be separated from the immediate consumption, manipulable and transferable via private labor markets. Labor turns into an object that can be exchanged on stock exchange. Its buyer, the mediator, can exert the right to rent it or to resell it for exploitation in the process of production. So I expect in the near future somehow a labor stock exchange when the labors can be, when the labors themselves can be an object or a commodity. Or if we put it in everyday language, translate the same process in the everyday language, what is happening is human trafficking for labor exploitation that is becoming an everyday practice of supplying and purchasing labor power. This is a new form of slavery which is not going to be stopped unless working people impose nationalization of private labor markets as well as control over production and socialization of its products. And with this I will stop my presentation. Thank you very much.